Welcome back. This time moving on to Chapter 20, Designing Endurance Training Programs. So as you can imagine, this stuff duplicates a lot of what we talked about in Coaching 345, where we talked about endurance training in there. We talked about paces and how to structure the program and that kind of stuff. And so Chapter 20 does the same thing. So I'm going to try not to belabor the points too much, other than there are a couple handy tables, one in particular that I'll point out. But we'll just kind of run through this stuff fairly quickly since, like I said, it is largely a review from something we just covered in Coaching 345. All right, so maximal aerobic capacity, also known as VO2 max. So remember that your VO2 max, or your aerobic capacity, is the ability to deliver and use oxygen. And so it is dictated by your cardiovascular function. So there are kind of central and peripheral adaptations. The central adaptations, or the central factors, are blood volume, which responds to training. So with training, you get increased blood volume, initially by an increase in plasma volume, followed over the course of several weeks with an increase in red blood cell volume, but an overall increase in volume with blood volume with training. And then remember that the left ventricle of the heart in particular gets more elastic, so it's more extensible. It snaps back, which is elasticity, more strongly, and then the left ventricular wall gets a little bit thicker, so it's able to contract more strongly as well. So we see those adaptations in the heart and in the blood, and then at the level of the trained muscle, remember that we're going to get more capillaries, more mitochondria, more myoglobin, more citric acid cycle enzymes, and more glycogen. And so with all of those adaptations, then we get better able to use oxygen. We get more of the fuels that we can use in the form of glycogen. And so that enables us to deliver and use oxygen to produce energy aerobically, so we can produce lots of ATP and maintain a high intensity for a longer period of time. All right. We've talked about lactate threshold before, so that is the definition differs a little bit in the different chapters, so I'll just read to you the definition here in this chapter. So lactate threshold, the speed of movement or the percentage of VO2 max at which a specific blood lactate concentration is observed, or the point at which blood lactate concentration begins to increase above resting levels. So one of the things with this definition of lactate threshold is they're almost kind of running that in together with what we talked about with onset of blood lactate accumulation, or OBLA. They're kind of using lactate threshold interchangeably for those two concepts, both lactate threshold and OBLA, which is fairly common. So just something to be aware of that we previously, so we talked about that first part there where a specific blood lactate concentration is observed. We talked about that as OBLA, and then rising above resting levels, we talked about that as lactate threshold in a previous chapter. So just be aware, in this chapter, they're kind of running those two together. But why that matters, right? So if we think about lactate threshold as the point or the proportion of VO2 max at which somebody starts to significantly accumulate lactate, right? So eventually you're going to accumulate enough lactate that you're going to have to stop, right? And so because the muscle gets too acidic, and so that interferes with the contractile mechanisms, interferes with glycolysis, etc., and so eventually you have to stop. So one of the things with really elite endurance athletes is they tend to have fairly similar VO2 maxes. So if you have, two elite marathon runners, they're both going to have VO2 maxes, let's say in the 70s, maybe the low 80s. And so because of that, the key differentiator appears to be their lactate threshold. So if we have, let's say, two elite marathoners who have a VO2 max of 80, and one of them accumulates or hits their lactate threshold at, let's say, 80% of that VO2 max versus the other person hits it at 85% of the VO2 max, that means that the second person who hits it at 85% can be traveling at a faster speed. They can be running at a little bit higher intensity before they start to really accumulate lactic acid, and so they can run faster before that lactate accumulation becomes a limiter on their performance. So for really elite endurance athletes, it doesn't appear to be their VO2 max that's the limiter, it appears to be lactate threshold. Now that said, one of the other possible limiters of performance is their exercise economy. At an elite level, again, they're going to be pretty economical. We've talked about this concept before. So it's the measure of energy cost at a given velocity. So it is if the individual is running at a speed of 10 miles an hour, how much oxygen are they consuming? And so we're not measuring energy directly, obviously, but we're using oxygen consumption as a proxy for that. So the athlete that can use less oxygen and thus less energy to run at a given speed is a more efficient runner. And so they should be able to go faster and for longer. So exercise economy plays a really important role in running. It's called running economy, but there are different forms of it in different endurance sports. But the idea there is that, again, a more economical athlete is one who uses a lower amount of energy to maintain a given pace. And so because of that, especially if we're talking about really long endurance events, so things like marathons or Ironman races, those kinds of things, that ability to use less energy to maintain a given pace becomes really important over the course of those several hours that race takes. So in terms of designing a program, this chapter runs you through steps just like the other chapters. So when we're designing a program, the first thing is exercise mode. Remember that mode is what we're actually doing. So in the case of endurance training, exercise mode includes things like cycling, running, swimming, and various other activities, rowing, for example. So in terms of the mode, if you've got a cross-country athlete, probably the mode that they're going to spend the vast majority of their time doing, especially close to the season and during the season, is going to be running. But in the off season, they may spend some time cycling, they may spend some time swimming, especially like immediate postseason. They may do some swimming, some deep water running, that kind of stuff. And actually, to be honest, they might do some deep water running during the season as a recovery thing as well. But as you can see there, the more specific the training mode is to the sport, then the more effective it is at enhancing performance. So if we have an athlete who is a swimmer spend a lot of time running, that'll help them make some of those central adaptations that facilitate aerobic capacity. So, it'll affect the heart and it'll affect the blood volume. But because the athlete isn't training the musculature that they use in swimming, it's not going to help their swimming performance as much as doing the actual sport. So if we were having them do some kind of cross training, maybe we'd have this swimmer work on the upper body bike some, because that's more similar to the demands of their sport than running is. So just something to consider there. So exercise mode, what is it that they're doing for their exercise? So, in other contexts, when we talk about weight training, exercise mode is, are they squatting, deadlifting, etc. Training frequency, how often are they training per week? With endurance training, they train a lot. So typically they'll train 5 or more days a week. They may train multiple times a day if we're talking about pretty high level athletes. But when somebody's initially getting into it, obviously they're going to have a lower training frequency. So, 2, maybe 3 times per week as their initial training frequency. So, one of the other things, and I mentioned this in 345 as well, is that in endurance training programs with respect to frequency, one of the things that we consider is how many quality days per week do they have. It may only be 2 or 3 quality or 2 or 3 hard days, and the rest of the days are going to be at basically an easy pace, and we'll talk more about that later, although we covered that in 345 as well. There we go. All right, now we're able to change. So training intensity. So obviously, as we've discussed in other contexts, adaptations are dependent upon the intensity. If they do high intensity aerobic exercise, so that's things, more than, depends on how you want to define high intensity, but let's say certainly more than 80% of their aerobic capacity, then that's going to increase their cardiovascular and respiratory function, particularly their cardiovascular function. And that's going to start to use the muscle fibers that they're going to engage during a race. And then, so the last little point there about exercise intensity can also benefit skeletal muscle adaptations. So think back to what we talked about with muscle fiber recruitment or motor unit recruitment, that when we work at lower intensities, we're going to recruit the type 1 fibers. When we start to move a little bit faster, so more like 70-ish% of VO2 max, now we're going to start to get into the type 2A fibers. And then once we start getting closer to that, like 80-85%, now we're going to start to recruit the type 2X fibers. So if you don't run fast in your training and you never recruit those type 2X fibers, then those fibers are never able to make the adaptations that they're going to need to make. And those include the things I talked about earlier, So things, again, like more capillaries, more mitochondria, more citric acid cycle enzymes, all those sort of things. If you don't recruit those fibers, they don't make those adaptations. So if you have somebody that's, trying to run a 10K race recreationally, and they always go out and run at 70% of their VO2 max, and then during the race, they're trying to run at more like 80, 85%. Well, now they're recruiting muscle fibers, some of the type 2Xs that they've never recruited in training. So those fibers are essentially untrained fibers, even though they're in the quads or in the hamstrings, etc. And so they're going to start to accumulate lactate fairly quickly because of the lack of training of those fibers. So we have to vary the training intensity, and we have to do fairly high intensity training in order to increase their aerobic capacity, but also to make sure that we get those local training adaptations in all the muscle fibers that we want. All right, so this is the really handy chart. I'll talk about that more in a second. So with training intensity, the most common way to measure it is using heart rate, because that's pretty easy. You just strap a heart rate monitor on them and then let them go. So the reason this one is really handy is that it shows the relationship between VO2 max and the percent of max heart rate. So oftentimes you'll see exercise prescriptions of they should work at 70% of their VO2 max. Well, that's cool, but if I haven't done lab testing, I don't know what that is. Like, I don't know how fast that is. I don't know a way to measure that. So this chart is helpful because it shows, okay, so if the prescription is you need to work at 70% of your VO2 max, well, that's 81% of your maximum heart rate. And your maximum heart rate is pretty easy to calculate. So, yeah, so I think it's useful in that context, or you'll see, high intensity interval training is more than 90% of their VO2 max. So what's that equate to as far as, if they're using heart rate? Well, that's 96 to 98% or 96+% of their maximum heart rate. So that's the useful thing in that chart there. Other ways to do target heart rate calculations. So this is probably the best way. It requires a little math on our part, but this is probably the most effective way to measure training intensity using heart rate. So the first thing you have to figure out is their age predicted maximum heart rate, which is APMHR, and all the abbreviations that follow. So they actually use 220 minus age, so that'll work. So let's say you're 20 years old. So your age predicted maximum heart rate then is 200. So the next thing we have to figure out is heart rate reserve. So what we're going to do is take your age predicted maximum heart rate, so 200, minus your resting heart rate. And so to do resting heart rate, that's where you just sit there quietly, preferably like first thing in the morning, and you take your heart rate. So that's your resting heart rate. Let's say your resting heart rate is 60. So you take 200 minus 60, and then that is your heart rate reserve. And so then to find your target heart rate, if we're having somebody do an easy pace, oftentimes that'll come with like a heart rate range. You want them between like 50 and 70% of their let's go with that. So 50, 70% of their max heart rate, something like that. So one of the things you could do here is to do your heart rate reserve times the exercise intensity, and then add back in your resting heart rate. And so you do that calculation twice to determine their target heart rate range. So, if we're trying to have them exercise between 70 and 80%, then we would set it up that way. The other thing is that the percent of heart rate reserve corresponds pretty closely to VO2 max. So just something else that's pretty handy from this little chart here. We can also do just a straight percentage of their maximum heart rate. The reason the Karvonen method is handy is that it takes into account training, like it takes into account conditioning, in that the better shape that you're in, the lower your resting heart rate is going to be, right? So if somebody's a well-conditioned athlete, they're going to have a resting heart rate in the 50s, maybe down into the 40s. As opposed to somebody who is sedentary is going to have a resting heart rate more like 70. So the useful thing about the Karvonen method is it takes into account not only your age, but then also to some extent your conditioning, because it accounts for your resting heart rate. This one does not. So this is just straight age. So it is 220 minus age. So we'll use our 20-year-old example. So where this one would come in is if we have somebody, let's say they want to engage in moderate intensity exercise for their 300 minutes a week or whatever. So to get moderate intensity exercise, there's some variability here, but one of the common ranges for moderate intensity exercise is between 55 and 70% of their max heart rate. So then all you do is to take 200, because that's their age predicted max heart rate, times 0.55 to get a target heart rate there, or times 0.7 to get the top end, and then that's their target heart rate range for moderate intensity. And you can do above 70% for vigorous exercise, or above 74% depending on which organization's guidelines you want to use. RPE stuff, you can use this. I think you've probably used it in exercise physiology. I've never done much with RPE personally, but the idea here is that you have them give you a subjective feeling about how difficult this is. So it's been updated to be a 1 to 10 scale. It used to be a 1 to 20 scale, or I think it was actually like a 6 to 20 scale. The idea is that the scale correlated with their heart rate. So if somebody said something was maximum effort, can't go any further, they would rate that a 20. And so in theory, then their heart rate would be close to 200. Or if it was very, very hard, then that would be more like 190, 180, etc. So it's been pared down a little bit. It's been cut in half, so it's only a 1 to 10 as opposed to, like I said, like 6 to 20. But one of the problems with this is, as you can see, it can be influenced by external environmental factors. So things like music can reduce your perception of exertion, caffeine, peers being around you can reduce your perception of exertion versus, exercising by yourself. So those kinds of things. So it's not the most accurate measure. Certainly you'd prefer to use heart rate as a measure of intensity, but this is one of the ways that we can measure intensity, is how hard does it feel like to the athlete or to the individual. Another thing that we can use is METs. You don't see METs used very much anymore outside of a clinical setting. Older cardio machines would oftentimes have METs on there. But METs is often used for moderate versus vigorous exercise. So one MET is the amount of oxygen you can see the calculation there, but basically it is your resting metabolic rate. And so if you're exercising at 3 METs, that's 3 times your resting metabolic rate, as opposed to 6 METs, which is 6 times your resting metabolic rate. And the reason those numbers matter is that 3 to 6 METs is typically moderate intensity exercise, and then above 6 is typically considered vigorous intensity. So you'll see METs used to measure intensity sometimes with like epidemiology stuff, where they talk about how much exercise people are getting, the combination of volume and intensity. So that's where METs come up. Or like I said, in a clinical setting, like in cardiac rehab, you'll use METs as well. One of the things you can do with those is you can kind of compare machines or compare different modes of exercise. So, 3 METs walking versus 3 METs on a bike versus 3 METs on an upper body bike ergometer. Those will feel different. Like the upper body bike ergometer is probably going to feel harder than walking, but the oxygen consumption is the same. So that's the utility of METs. Power measurement, you can use that on things like bicycles, but oftentimes they're used for ergometers in the gym. So like stationary bike, a rowing ergometer, you can use them on the skier. Sometimes like the upper body bike will have them too. And so it's just another way to measure power. So it'll be like if you want to work vigorously on an exercise bike, on a stationary bike, you need to be above 175 watts or something like that. And you also use that as a power measure when you took XPhys as well, I assume. All right, so then the other thing, once we've looked at intensity, exercise duration, how long are they exercising, and of course there's an inverse relationship between intensity and duration. The more intense the exercise, the shorter the duration, and vice versa. Exercise progression, this number is always in these endurance training talks. So increase by no more than 10% a week, particularly with respect to duration. Usually it's measured, like in the case of running, oftentimes it's total mileage is the number that's discussed. You don't want to increase your mileage more than 10%. And that is very much a ballpark figure. But the basic rationale there is that if you take really big jumps, let's say you increase your volume by, 25% in 1 week or 50% in 1 week, that's probably going to be more likely to cause an injury, right? So that you may end up with a stress fracture, you may end up with tendonitis, etc. And so the idea is that we progress it slowly so that we avoid some of those overuse injuries. All right, so there are different training paces, and again, we talked about this in 345, but the different training paces, so long, slow distance training, this is kind of the base pace. So our runners will run at this or a little bit slower for like their warm up, for their cool down, and then for a lot of their other days per week. It's a little bit slower than this, but it's pretty close. And so you can see that corresponds to about 70% of their VO2 max. And so if you want to know what that is with respect to heart rate, because that's a more useful number. So you're going to be running somewhere around 80% of their maximum heart rate. Like I said, much more useful. The other types of training, so pace or tempo training, typically those are performed in 20 to 30 minute bouts, usually consecutively, although you can break them down into, let's say, 2 10-minute bouts or 3 10-minute bouts or 2 15s or whatever. It's pretty fast, but it starts to be a little uncomfortable. So they're at or slightly above their lactate threshold, so they're starting to accumulate lactate. So it's running fast and being slightly uncomfortable for a relatively long period of time. Interval training is pretty intense, so close to your VO2 max, so essentially right at your max heart rate for 3 to 5 minutes. High intensity interval training is close to a sprint because it's above your VO2 max, and so obviously you're going to generate pretty significant lactate there. You can see a fairly short, or I guess, yeah, let's go with that. So fairly short work period, so 30 seconds, and then you're going to rest for 150 seconds, something like that, as opposed to the interval training is more of a 1-to-1 ratio. So interval training is more improving your VO2 max. High intensity interval training also does do that. If you shorten these things, so if you shorten the rest intervals, it can improve your lactate threshold as well. And then fartlek training is a type of interval training. It's basically where it's speed play is what the name means. I think it's Swedish. And so basically the athlete will run and then they'll do an interval for however long they feel like doing it for several minutes. And then they'll slow back down and then they'll run or go faster and slow back down. And so it's not as rigidly timed as these other things. And so that's kind of one of the appeals. It's something that can like be done out on a trail run, especially for your cross-country runners or your more recreational type athletes. They can just like, I'm going to go faster for a little bit and then slow back down, that kind of thing. So it's sort of an intervals based on feel or based on RPE. So the rest of these slides are just elaborations on this chart. So you can see long, slow distance training. So those are, if you're working with an athlete who's training for a marathon, those are usually their Sunday runs where they go out and they run 20 miles or something like that. That'll oftentimes be at this long, slow distance pace. It can be used as a recovery run. That's what this is. And then it can train your type 1 and your type 2X fibers. It's interesting that in reading this bullet point, because one of the earlier chapters said that fiber types don't change. Now the 2X become more like the 2As, but the 2As still stay 2s. So anyway, just that was interesting in reading that as I was talking. Intensity is pretty low. Yeah, there's that. So basically, like I said, long, slow distance training is kind of like the base training pace. It is what the athlete does as a warm-up, as a cool-down, and then all of their runs, essentially, that are not their quality runs. Pace or tempo training, so again, that above lactate threshold pace for 20 to 30 minutes, and you can break it down, but oftentimes it's done continuously for 20 or 30 minutes. And so you can see why we're doing this is to increase lactate threshold, but also to develop a sense of what it's going to be like to run at a race pace, so they can feel that sort of discomfort that they're going to get during the actual race. Interval training, this stuff's mostly covered on that chart, but you can see one of the things it does is improves your VO2 max, enhances your anaerobic metabolism. So one of the things with interval training is that it produces enough venous return that you get a pretty significant stretching of the heart. And so interval training, this really higher intensity stuff, is going to be pretty effective at increasing cardiac output. It really fosters those adaptations in the heart that I talked about earlier. Increased left ventricle extensibility, increased left ventricle wall thickness, all that kind of stuff. Interval training, this particular intensity really trains that fairly effectively. High intensity interval training we've talked about in multiple other chapters. So training above 90% of their VO2 max, and you can refer back to the earlier chart to see what that number is from a max heart rate standpoint. So the duration of these vary. You can do long ones for 2 to 3 minutes. That's rough. But typically you're going to do a little bit shorter ones, so maybe more like 30 seconds with 30 seconds or less of rest. And then there's even alterations on that, right? Where there's 10 seconds on, 20 seconds off, or vice versa. 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, something like that. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can do this, but the gist of it is that you want to accumulate several minutes above 90% of their VO2 max. Fartlek training we talked about, so speed play. So easy running, so that long, slow distance pace, and then shorter bursts of 85 to 90% of their VO2 max. And like I said, it's kind of based on feel. So when they feel good, they run faster, and then when they feel like they've accumulated a bunch of lactate, then they're going to slow back down. This stuff is just basic program design, how you're going to outline the training year. Same kind of stuff we've talked about before in this class and also in the 345 class. Cross training. There it is. Okay, so cross training. So one of the things that cross training can do, especially if you're like a runner and involved in a sport that involves a lot of pounding, is can allow you to continue to train the cardiovascular system without that constant pounding. So, you could have a runner do cycling. And so that way they're still training the cardiovascular system, but they're not stressing the skeletal system of the lower body quite as much. So that is a useful thing to consider, especially in the off season. Detraining, just like anything else, use it or lose it. The first thing to go is your blood volume. So you're going to lose plasma volume in particular pretty quickly. And so that'll go away within 7 to 10 days. You'll start to lose some plasma volume, and that'll result in decreased aerobic capacity. But because it goes away pretty quickly, it also comes back pretty quickly when you start training again. Tapering, we talked about in 345. The idea is that you have them do high intensity, high volume, such that they overreach and they sort of push right up against that border of becoming overtrained. And then we decrease the volume in particular with some slight decreases in intensity leading up to the competition so that they are rested, recovered, and ready to go for the competition. Resistance training appears to enhance endurance performance, may improve things like running economy. Now that said, most of the recommendations I've seen are to do really heavy resistance training. So you wouldn't have your cross-country runners do sets of 25 and 30 because they already have pretty good muscular endurance. Why would you train that in the weight room? And so instead, what you would do is to have them lift fairly heavy, so more than 80% of their 1 rep max, to increase that tendon stiffness, to increase muscle strength, muscle power, etc. So that way you help them, as it says at the bottom there, like during breakaways or in that final sprint, but also probably helps improve their running economy. And the last thing here is altitude. So typically altitude acclimatization takes about 2 weeks up to moderate altitudes. And so the altitude adaptations include things like more red blood cells. You get more of the enzymes that help your red blood cells. We'll skip that. More red blood cells. Let's leave it at that. That's the big one. There are a few other adaptations you get to altitude, but that's the big one. And they mimic pretty closely the adaptations you get to aerobic training. So that's why living in altitude would be beneficial for endurance athletes. And that's it for chapter 20. Like I said, I tried to keep it short because it rehashes a lot of stuff we've already talked about. But definitely take advantage of that chart that shows the relationship between maximum heart rate and VO2 max. Like I said, I think that one's very handy. And so next time we'll move on to chapter 21. So we'll see you then.